All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a really interesting topic that you've been wanting to explore, the Mu'tazila.
Definitely a fascinating group. Lots of historical significance and some really unique ideas.
For sure, and we're going to get into all that, but not like, a boring textbook history lecture or anything.
Hey, the goal here is to pull out the most interesting and kind of crucial points to give you a good grasp of who these folks were.
Yeah, like a shortcut to understanding their origins, their main beliefs, the 5 principles and all that, and the impact they had on Islamic thought.
Exactly. We're aiming for, clarity first and foremost,
Yeah.
but hopefully some aha moments along the way too.
For sure. Okay, so let's just jump right in. How did this group, the Mu'tazila, even get that name in the first place?
That's the perfect starting point. Okay, so the name Mu'tazila comes from, it's derived from this Arabic verb, itazala, which means literally to withdraw or to separate oneself.
Right, and I remember from the research we did, that idea of separation is like key to understanding them.
Absolutely. And the most common historical account links it back to this disagreement with a very respected figure at the time, Imam Hassan Basri. It had to do with the whole question of what's the theological status of someone who commits a major sin?
Okay, yeah, I remember that. Can you unpack that a bit? What was the point of contention, really?
So Hassan al-Basri, he was asked about this Muslim who commits a really grave sin.
Right.
And you had different views at the time. Like the Kharijites, they were saying, nope, that's it. They're a disbeliever now, out of Islam.
Right, super strict.
Yeah, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had the Murjiites who were on the other end of the spectrum saying, nah, those sins don't actually harm a person's faith. So there's this, tension between these views.
And that's where Wasil ibn Ata comes in, right? He was the one who offered a different perspective.
Exactly. So Wasil ibn Ata, he was part of Hassan al-Basri's circle at the time, but he disagreed. He put forward this idea of, it's called manzila baina al-manzalatin, which basically means an intermediate state. So neither a full believer nor a disbeliever.
Okay, so kind of like a middle ground. And this is where the whole withdrawal thing happens, right?
Exactly. So following this disagreement, Wasil actually withdrew, Itazala, and went to a pillar in the mosque and started teaching his own followers there. So Hassan al-Basri famously said, Itazala Wasil has withdrawn from us.
So that's like the origin story of the name, the big separation moment.
Yeah, that's the primary count most scholars go with.
But I also remember reading that there are other ideas about where the name came from, right? It's not like 100% settled.
Right, you're spot on. It's not quite so cut and dry. There are these alternative perspectives floating around.
Okay, well, what are some of those other ideas?
Well, like Imam al-Baghdadi, he suggested that Hassan al-Basri didn't just let Wasil walk away. He actually kicked him out because of his bid'ah, his theological innovation regarding that whole grave sinner issue.
Right, bid'ah meaning like a deviation or something.
Exactly. And then Wasil went and Intizala with Amr ibn Ubaid, another key early figure in the movement. And then there's this other account attributed to, Qatada ibn Diama al-Dusai, a hadith scholar. He apparently saw Amr ibn Ubaid and his posse forming their own group and just exclaimed, these are the Mu'tazila. So it might have been an outsider observation too.
That's interesting. So maybe the name wasn't something they chose, but something that was kind of put upon them.
That's a possibility.
Were there any really out there theories?
Oh yeah, there are a few more, but they're not as widely accepted. One idea is that they called themselves Mu'tazila because they saw themselves as withdrawing from the whole political mess between Ali ibn Abi Talib and Muawiyah.
Right. Those were some intense times.
For sure. Then there's another theory linking the name to their emphasis on asceticism, like being detached from worldly pleasures. And then there's this idea that because they viewed the grave sinner as in a state of withdrawal from both believers and disbelievers, the name just kind of stuck.
Ah, I see. So multiple interpretations all revolving around that idea of separation.
Yeah, pretty much. And you also have al-Baghdadi saying that it was the Sunni Muslims who coined the term Mu'tazila to highlight their difference on the grave sinner issue. And al-Masudi, he directly connected it to their manzila baina al-manzilatain principle.
Okay, so lots of different threads, but all kind of weaving around the same idea. So to sum up, what's the most likely story here?
Well, the scholarly consensus, and the video supports this, is that the Mu'tazila as a distinct school really started with Wasil ibn Ata and Amr ibn Ubaid breaking away from Hassan al-Basri's group in Basra because of those theological differences, the whole grave sinner debate.
Right, that's the core of it.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that even among themselves, the Mu'tazilics didn't like immediately settle on that name universally. It seems like it became more of a fixed thing over time.
Makes sense. A label that started externally but ended up reflecting their identity pretty well. So moving on, the video also talked about other names, alternative names, used for the Mu'tazila. Why was that? What can those other names tell us about them?
You know, those alternative names, a lot of times they came from their critics. They often pointed to what those critics saw as like problematic aspects of their beliefs.
Okay, so not necessarily friendly labels.
Right. So, for example, they were sometimes called the Jamia. And this links them to an earlier group who had some similar ideas, especially around not describing God in human-like terms.
Avoiding anthropomorphism.
Exactly. And Ibn Taymiyyah, he was a really prominent scholar who came later. He even said that, every Mu'tazili is essentially a Jami, but not every Jami is a Mu'tazili, because in his view, Jam went further in denying certain attributes of God.
Okay, so a label highlighting a shared theological territory, even if to different degrees. What about those terms Thanawiyya and Majus? Those sound a bit like terms from a different religious context almost.
They do, right. Those names, meaning dualists and Magians, they got slapped with those because of their idea that good comes from God and evil comes from humans. Their critics saw this as being a bit too close for comfort to those old Persian beliefs about these two opposing forces, good and evil, like in Zoroastrianism.
Interesting. So it was a way to connect them to a dualistic worldview, which their opponents obviously saw as a problem.
Precisely. And al-Makrizi, he made that same connection too. It's fascinating how the video mentioned that some of the early Mutazilites actually sometimes attributed the creation of evil to Satan.
Yeah.
Which, if you think about it, kind of fits with some of those old Persian ideas.
Right, like a separate evil force sort of thing. So the Sanawiyya label was all about criticizing how they dealt with the problem of evil.
Exactly.
What about Wa'idiyya? What was that about?
Wa'idiyya. That one means those of the threat. And it gets its name from their strong emphasis on God's promises and threats. The idea that good deeds get rewarded and bad deeds get punished, no two ways about it.
So a name based on their strong belief in divine justice and consequences.
Exactly. And it wasn't always used in a nice way. The video even mentioned a Murji'ite poet using this term to kind of mock a Mutazilite scholar. It was like, oh, you're all about the threats, are you?
So a label rooted in a core doctrine, but sometimes weaponized by their opponents. Makes sense. What about Mu'attila? That sounds a bit like a negative term, like nullification or something.
It does have a negative ring to it, for sure. Mu'attila means those who nullify, or those who devoid. And this one stuck because of how they interpreted God's attributes. They often favored allegorical readings, which some saw as basically emptying God of the qualities described in the Quran and Sunnah. Al-Shahrastani, he defined ta'til as basically neglecting the obvious meaning of the Quran and Sunnah. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, he also really refuted this label in his writings.
Right, so again, a name highlighting a key point of disagreement, in this case, their approach to understanding God. And what about Qadariyya? Isn't that the term for those who believe in free will, which the Mu'tazila definitely did? Seems ironic.
Oh, it is definitely ironic. See, they got labeled as Qadariyya, those who affirm free will, because they rejected the idea of predestination. They said humans have their own power to act. But funny thing is, they didn't actually like that name.
Why is that?
Well, al-Baghdadi and Ibn Taymiyyah, they explained that it was actually their opponents who called them Qadariyya, to kind of criticize them for denying God's predetermined plan for everything.
So it was like a label based on a core belief, but one they didn't consider a positive reflection of their stance.
Exactly.
So we've covered the names others gave them, but what about their own preferred names? How did they describe themselves?
Well, even though Mu'tazila was given to them initially, they did come to embrace it over time. But they did have their preferred self-designations. The most common one, and it really sums up a lot of their beliefs, is al-alan wa al-tawhid.
People of justice and oneness. Those sound like pretty fundamental concepts. Can you explain what they meant by those terms?
Sure. So Alan, meaning justice, was really important to them. And they applied it very specifically to the idea that humans, we create our own actions. It wasn't God making us do bad things. That would be unjust in their view. And Tawhid, oneness, that's about emphasizing God's absolute unity and avoiding any interpretation that might make it seem like there are multiple gods or that God is like us in any way. Al-Shahrastani, he also referred to them as Ashab al-Alba wa al-Tawhid. So you see, these weren't just neutral labels. They were really core to how they saw themselves.
Right, like a statement of identity and belief all rolled into one. Were there any other names they used that kind of reflected their self-perception?
Yeah, a few others that kind of show how strongly they believed they were on the right path, like al-Haq, people of truth, al-Firqa al-Najiyah, which translates to the saved sect, and munazihun lillah an al-Naqs, those who exonerate God from imperfection.
So really strong claims. It sounds like they were pretty confident in their theology. And how about the terms they used for their opponents? That can often be revealing.
Oh, absolutely. And they had a whole bunch of those too, each one kind of highlighting what they saw as the big error in their opponent's thinking.
Like what?
Well, you had mujbira determinists, for those who emphasize predestination. And ironically, they sometimes also used Qadariya for their opponents, even though they themselves were called that too.
Right, throwing the label back at them.
Exactly. Then you have mujawiza, which means those who permit evil to God, criticizing those who believe God creates evil, and mujaviya for anthropomorphists, who took descriptions of God too literally, and hashwiya, meaning literalists, and mujia, procrastinators of judgment. So they had a whole arsenal of terms to define themselves against those who disagreed with them.
It's clear they saw themselves as holding the correct theological position against, various errors. So to wrap up this whole names discussion, what's the main takeaway here?
The key thing is that while Mujasila became the common label, it wasn't their own initial choice. It reflects that initial separation, that withdrawal from the mainstream. But they did favor terms like al-Tahid, people of justice and oneness, which really points to their key beliefs. And even later, Mutazilite scholars like Abu al-Hussein al-Khayyat preferred those self-chosen names, showing how important those concepts were to them.
Okay, so we've got the name story down. Now let's shift gears and talk about the rise of Mutazilism. When and where did this movement really start to gain traction?
Well, the video points to Basra, which was a major intellectual center back then, and the time frame was roughly around 105 to 110 AH. And as we've already mentioned, Wasil ibn Ata is generally considered the founder. He died around 131 AH. And fun fact, he was nicknamed Al-Ghazal, the Gazelle.
The Gazelle. Catchy nickname. Why'd he get that one?
Apparently, he was often seen in the gazelle market in Basra, giving charity to women in need.
Ah, that's a nice little detail. So this pivotal moment for the emergence of Mutazilism was really his disagreement with Hassan al-Basri right there in Basra.
Yeah, that debate in Hassan al-Basri's gatherings about the grave center, that's really what kicked things off. Wasil had his own view, that whole intermediate state idea, and that led him to break away and start his own following.
Right, the big separation moment. But the video also mentions some less likely theories about their origins. What were those?
Yeah, there are a couple of other ideas floating around, but they're not as historically solid. Like, there's this one theory mentioned by a scholar named Abu al-Hasan al-Malati that says the Mutazila actually came from a group of Ali's supporters who were like, we're done with politics, after Hassan made that agreement with Muawiyah. So they withdrew from both sides, hence the Mutazila label.
Okay, interesting. Any others?
Yeah, some from a branch of Shia Islam, the Rafida, claimed that Mutazila ideas actually predate Wasil, going back to figures like Zayd ibn Ali. And a scholar named Ibn al-Murtada even attributed the whole concept of itadaizal to Ali ibn Abi Talib himself.
So claims of an even earlier origin.
Right. But as the video pointed out, these accounts aren't as strong as the one centered on Wasil and his split from Hassan al-Basri.
Okay, so we're sticking with Wasil as the founder in early 2nd century AH Basra. Now, how did their ideas spread from that initial group?
That's a good question. A few things helped them gain influence. First, the early Islamic world was already buzzing with intellectual debate and disagreements about theology. So it was fertile ground for new ideas.
Right, lots of different interpretations floating around.
Exactly. And secondly, and this is really important, they got support from some of the Abbasid caliphs.
So political backing, that can be pretty helpful.
Oh yeah, huge boost for spreading their ideas. It gave them resources and platforms.
Makes sense. What else?
Well, the Mutasila, they didn't just stay in their own bubble. They were interacting with people of other faiths too, like Christians and Zoroastrians. This exposure to different perspectives probably sharpened their own arguments and made them more appealing to a wider audience.
So engaging with the broader intellectual landscape of the time.
Exactly. And then there's another big one. They embraced philosophy, especially Greek logic and methods of debate. This gave them really powerful tools to articulate and defend their views in a very systematic way.
So reason and logic were key for them.
Absolutely. That focus on reason was a big part of their appeal, especially to the educated elite.
Okay, that paints a really clear picture of how they went from a small group to a more influential movement. Now, from what I remember, the Mu'tazila weren't just one big homogenous group, right? They had different schools of thought within the movement.
You got it. They weren't all on the same page about every single detail. Over time, different sub-schools popped up, each with its own nuances and interpretations.
Okay, can we break down some of those key early schools?
Definitely. So first up, you have the Wasiliya, the direct followers of Wasil ibn Ata himself. They're the ones who really solidified those 5 principles that became central to Mu'tazilite identity.
So the OG Mu'tazila, so to speak.
Pretty much. And there's this interesting tidbit. Al-Jahiz, a later Mu'tazilite scholar, attributed this rather controversial claim to Wasil that basically all Muslims after the Prophet, except for Ali, were actually disbelievers.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, definitely a bit out there. And al-Shahrastani, another scholar, he summarized their main ideas, denying God's attributes as literally described in the Quran and Sunnah, because they were worried about affirming multiple eternal beings, fiercely affirming free will, and that doctrine of the intermediate state for great sinners. So this was the foundation, the core group around Wasil.
So that's the starting point. What other schools branched out from there?
Well, next you have the Amriya, or Umraya, followers of Amr ibn Ubaidah. He teamed up with Wasil early on and became a major figure, even leading the Mu'tazila for a while. Then you got the Hudhaya, followers of Abu Ahud Hayal al-Alaf. Now, he was a real intellectual heavyweight. He dove deep into Greek philosophy and brought those ideas into Mu'tazilite theology.
Sounds like he really pushed their thinking in new directions.
He did. The video outlined some of his unique views, like saying that God's knowledge and power are the same as his essence. And he believed in contingent human wills existing alongside God's will. And he had these pretty complex ideas about the Quran being created and certain aspects being in a place and others not. And he even had interesting things to say about free will in this life versus the afterlife. And this idea that eventually all movement stops, and in paradise and hell, you just reach a state of pure pleasure or pain.
Wow, he really tackled some big questions.
Yeah, he did. He also had specific views about lifespans and provisions being fixed. So Abu al-Hudhayl brought real philosophical depth to their thought.
Okay, Abu al-Hudhayl, the philosopher. Got it. What about the Nizamiya? That sounds like a very structured kind of name.
It did, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The Nizamiya were the followers of Ibrahim al-Nizam. Funny thing is, he was actually known for organizing bees in the market.
That's unexpected.
It is. But he also had some really unique and sometimes pretty controversial theological views. For instance, he said God couldn't be described as having power over evil and disobedience. And he thought God couldn't change the suffering of hell or the joy of paradise, and couldn't remove anyone from either place either.
That raises questions about how he saw divine power, for sure.
Right. And get this. He rejected the idea of consensus and analogical reasoning as valid ways to figure out Islamic law. He was all about the authority of the infallible imam, which, might suggest some Shia influence.
Okay, so a bit different on the legal reasoning front.
Yeah, for sure. And he had some other unusual beliefs. Like, he said God created everything, minerals, plants, animals, humans, all at the same time. No Adam coming before descendants. He also said the real human is the soul, not the body. Oh, and he agreed with those Greek philosophers about matter being infinitely divisible. No indivisible atoms for him.
So lots of philosophical influence there, too.
Tons. And his most famous idea, maybe, is the theory of Tafra. It's this idea of like a sudden leap. A body can move from one spot to another instantly, no need to travel through the space in between.
Well, that's kind of mind-bending.
It is, right? Almost like those quantum mechanics ideas that physicists talk about nowadays.
Yeah, way ahead of his time.
He was. And to top it off, he had some really controversial views about the Imadi. And he made some pretty extreme claims about what Umar ibn al-Khattab did to Fatima that, historians don't really buy those claims. And get this, he thought those creatures that are usually considered impure, like scorpions and snakes, even pigs, would be resurrected into paradise. No turning to dust for them.
Wow, he was a real out-of-the-box thinker.
Totally. Al-Nizam was all about pushing those intellectual boundaries. And you can tell from his background. He was deep into philosophy, and it interacted with all kinds of religious groups in his youth.
So Al-Nizam, the radical innovator. Any other early schools worth mentioning?
Yeah, the video also talked about the Thumamiyya, the followers of Thumama ibn Ashras. He was a big leader of the Qadariya, remember, those who believe in free will during the time of a few different Abbasid caliphs. He was really strict about divine punishment. He said that even if a Muslim just dies with one major sin, boom, straight to hell forever, along with the worst of the worst, like Pharaoh.
Wow, no room for leniency there.
Not really. And to give you an idea of how diverse the Mu'tazila became, they eventually branched out into over 21 different groups, including the Salihiyya, the Askafiyya, and the Mushiyya.
21 groups, that really shows how much intellectual energy was within this movement. It wasn't just one static thing.
Not at all. Now, to get a better sense of how their ideas evolved over time, the video talked about different generations of Mu'tazilite thinkers.
Yeah, that makes sense. How do they categorize those generations?
Well, they break it down into three main periods. The early generation, that's the OG crew we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Wasil ibn Ata, Umar ibn Ubaid, and then you've got Muqawwil ibn Abdullah and Qatada ibn Di'ama al-Sadusi. Those are the ones who laid the groundwork.
Okay, and then who came next?
So the middle generation, that's where you have those big names like Abu al-Hudhal al-Alaf and al-Mijm, who we just discussed. And then there was this Abu Ishaq Ibrahim, not as famous, and Uthman ibn Khalid al-Tawil, who actually taught both Abu al-Hudhal and al-Mijm. This middle generation really took those initial ideas and went deep, incorporating more philosophical concepts and refining the arguments.
So building on the foundation. And what about the later generation?
The later generation, that's where you get some of the most famous names, the ones who really left a mark on Islamic thought.
Okay, who are we talking about?
Well, there's Abu Ali al-Jabai and his son, Abu Hashim al-Jabai. They were key figures in systematizing Mu'tazilite theology. And then you have Ahmad ibn Abi Duad. He was known for his eloquence and his close ties to Caliph al-Mamun. He was actually instrumental in that whole controversy about the Quran being created. And that was a period where Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he really stood up against the state's official position, which was influenced by the Mu'tazila.
Right, a time of real tension and conflict.
Yeah, definitely. And then, of course, you have Umar ibn Bar al-Jahiz. Man, he was a giant in Arabic literature. He wrote on tons of different subjects, like his Kitab al-Hayawan, the Book of Animals, is really famous, and so is his al-Bayan wa al-Tabian, Eloquence and Exposition, a true master of the language.
A real polymath.
Yeah, totally. And he was definitely leaning towards Mu'tazilite ideas. And then there's Qadi Abd al-Jabbar ibn Ahmad, also known as Qadi Abd al-Jabbar al-Mu'tazili, a top scholar in Basra. He wrote Shar al-Yusul al-Kamsa, which is basically an explanation of those 5 principles. Essential reading for anyone who wants to understand Mu'tazilite thought.
So a really key figure for understanding their core beliefs.
For sure. And there are some other big names from that later generation worth mentioning. Al-Sahih ibn Abad, a huge literary figure known for his massive library. Yahya ibn al-Mubarak, another important Mu'tazilite writer. Abu Muslim al-Isfahani, a leading grammarian and commentator on the Quran. Abu Bakr al-Lakwash, who wrote this unbelievably long commentary on the Quran. Abu Bakr al-Kindi al-Misri, another famous grammarian. Ali ibn Isa al-Rumani, a top-notch theologian and linguist. And finally, al-Zamakhshari, who wrote that super influential commentary on the Quran called Al-Kashaf, and other important linguistic works. So you can see how their influence spread across all sorts of intellectual fields.
Yeah, really impressive. It's clear that the Mu'tazila weren't just theologians, but also writers, grammarians, and commentators. Now let's dive into their most central ideas, the 5 principles. The video really stressed how important these are for understanding the Mu'tazila.
They are absolutely key. The video mentioned Abu al-Hasan al-Khayyat, who basically said, look, if you want to be considered a Mu'tazilite, you got to subscribe to all 5 of these. And those are At-Tawhid, oneness of God, Al-Justice of God, Al-Wa'id, promise and threat, Al-Manzila Baina Al-Manzilatain, the intermediate state, and Al-Amr bi al-Maruf wa al-Nahi and al-Munkar, enjoining good and forbidding evil. And they're usually listed in that order, which some people say reflects how important they were considered within the school.
So, a hierarchy of principles in a way. Let's unpack them one by one, starting with the first, al-Tawhid, the oneness of God. What was so special about the Mu'tazilite take on this?
For them, Tawhid wasn't just about saying, yeah, there's only one God. They got into some really deep and sometimes heated debates about what that actually means, about the nature of God's attributes.
Right, so getting into the nitty-gritty of what it means for God to be one.
Exactly. Their main concern was upholding God's absolute unity and transcendence, that he's totally unique and beyond anything we can imagine. And they were so cautious about affirming any eternal attributes alongside God's essence.
Why was that?
Well, they were worried that could lead to some form of polytheism, like suggesting there are multiple eternal beings. They were also worried it would somehow limit God's absolute oneness. And this is where you see some differences even within the Mu'tazila. Some of them even rejected the idea that God has an eternal will. proposing instead that his will is created and not inherent to his being.
So different interpretations even within the school.
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
They also generally denied that God has hearing and sight in the way we understand those things. And a big part of their approach was allegorical interpretation, tawil. They used this to make sense of certain verses in the Quran and Hadith, especially the ones that seem to contradict their understanding of God's oneness and transcendence.
So reinterpreting scripture to fit their theological framework.
Right. And this connects back to that initial point of contention with Hassan al-Basri. Remember, Wasil ibn Ata, he argued that if you say God has all these eternal attributes, it's like saying there are multiple eternal things existing, which he thought was a big no-no. And al-Shahrastani, he even pointed out that the Mu'tazila had something in common with certain philosophers in their rejection of those literal interpretations of God's attributes.
So their tawhid was all about protecting God's unity, even if it meant interpreting scripture in unconventional ways.
That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the second principle, alal, justice of God. What did that mean for the Mu'tazila?
Okay, so for them, adl justice wasn't just a nice quality of God. It was like a fundamental principle that governed everything he does.
So a core aspect of his very being.
Yeah, exactly. Qadi Abd al-Jabbar, that key Mu'tazilite scholar, he said that talking about God's justice naturally follows from their whole idea of his oneness. They were really big on the idea that God doesn't create evil actions. They thought that would be straight up unjust.
Because it would make him responsible for human wrongdoing.
Exactly. And they used both reason and scripture to back up this view. Sometimes they even reinterpreted or outright rejected verses that seemed to say that God makes people do bad things. This led them to really champion the idea of human free will and moral responsibility.
So humans are in the driver's seat, so to speak.
Right. They even had this concept of tawallud, which means generation or causation, to describe how humans are the true authors of their actions. And they believe that you can figure out what's good and what's evil through reason alone, even without divine revelation. They call that al-tasin wa al-tapi alakiyan. Basically, they believe that God, being perfectly just, would never do anything evil. All his actions have to be good and wise and make sense from the perspective of justice.
So a really strong emphasis on both God's justice and human freedom and responsibility. Okay, moving on to the third principle, al-wa'id, promise and threat. What's that all about?
This one's about their belief that God always keeps his promises, both the good ones rewarding the righteous and the scary ones punishing the wicked. No ifs, ands, or buts about it.
So divine accountability is a given.
Totally. And this goes hand in hand with their view of God's justice. They said a just God can't break his word or lie. And Qadi Abd al-Jabbar, he made it clear. Reward and punishment have to line up exactly with what a person does. Rewarding the bad or punishing the good would be like the opposite of justice, and that's just not possible for God in their view.
So no shortcuts, no getting off easy.
Nope. And this is actually what led them to question the traditional understanding of intercession, or shafa, the idea that